In 1903, Battle Creek, Michigan, a town of roughly 30,000 people, was home to more than 80 competing cereal companies. 80 pressing flakes from corn, from wheat, from oats and rice, flavored with everything from apples to celery. 80 chasing a market that had not existed a decade earlier. 80 in a town that had never manufactured a box of breakfast food before 1894. The entire American idea of cereal in a bowl, cornflakes, grape nuts, the whole ritual of the morning table was invented within a few blocks of one another, in this one town. Today, both corporate heirs of that empire are gone. Kellanova, sold to Mars for roughly $36 billion. W.K. Kellogg Company, sold to the Italian confectioner Ferrero for $3.1 billion. After 119 years, no independent company named Kellogg exists. What remains is a nickname, Cereal City, stamped on a town that no longer owns the industry it invented. Chapter 1. The Name of the Water. In 1824, a party of federal surveyors was cutting section lines through the wilderness of what would become Calhoun County, Michigan, mapping land the government intended to sell to settlers who had not yet arrived there. Along a narrow, fast stream threading through oak openings and marsh grass, the surveying party came into conflict with two Potawatomi men. The details of the confrontation were never fully recorded, and what survives comes only from the surveyor's side of it. But the fight was sharp enough and strange enough to the men filing the report that they gave the stream a name drawn directly from what had happened on its bank. Not a poetic name, not a borrowed one. An actual battle on an actual creek, and the name stayed on the water and later on the town that grew beside it. Battle Creek. 7 years passed before anyone built there to stay. In 1831, the first permanent settlers arrived at the point where Battle Creek met the larger Kalamazoo River, a confluence that gave the future town both a water supply and a natural crossroads. The land around it was still raw. Oak openings, prairie grass, Potawatomi villages working ground the surveyors had only just mapped. A confluence, though, was worth something to a settler with an eye for power. Within a few years, the site had a name, a mill claim, and a future. That future belonged largely to a land speculator named Sands McCamley, who understood what the rivers were worth before anyone else in the settlement did. McCamley secured the water rights at the confluence and in 1835 dug a canal to pull the current out of its bed and turn it into something usable. Power for a sawmill, power for a grist mill, power for every small workshop that would eventually crowd the canal's edge. It was a modest excavation, a few hundred feet of dug channel through sand and clay. But it was the town's first wager on itself. That falling water, properly captured, was worth more than the raw land around it. The settlement growing up along that canal turned out to be an unusual one. Battle Creek became a stronghold of Quakers and other reformers, the kind drawn to Michigan's frontier because it was far from established churches and established compromises. The Underground Railroad ran directly through the town, its station kept by a Quaker merchant and newspaper editor named Erastus Hussey, who later estimated that his network moved more than 1,000 escaped slaves north toward Canada under cover of the settlement's reputation. In 1857, that same reputation drew Sojourner Truth, the formerly enslaved abolitionist and women's rights orator, to settle just outside the town. She lived out the rest of her life there, dying in Battle Creek in 1883 and buried on a quiet rise at Oak Hill Cemetery, among neighbors who had no notion of what else that hillside would eventually hold. Keep that hillside in mind. The story comes back to it. The town's first real industry, when it arrived, had nothing to do with breakfast. In 1848, a firm called Nichols and Shepard began building threshing machines on the strength of the same water power McCamley had captured over a decade earlier. Heavy iron machinery sold to farmers clearing the wheat country of the Michigan interior. It ran on grain, but not the kind anyone would flake, box, and ship across a continent. That was still decades away. Chapter 2. The Word He Invented Himself. In 1855, 10 years before anyone in Battle Creek had heard of flaked cereal, a different kind of enterprise arrived to claim the town. The Seventh-day Adventist movement, still young, moved its headquarters to Battle Creek. The move was led by James White and his wife, Ellen White, the two figures standing at the head of the church. They brought a press, a following, and a doctrine that was already changing shape around them. This was not an industry in the way Nichols and Shepard was an industry. It manufactured nothing that could be loaded onto a rail car. What it manufactured was belief, and belief in Battle Creek was about to take a very specific shape. Ellen White's visions had begun prescribing something new, something closer to medicine than to Scripture, though she delivered it with the Scripture's authority. No meat, no alcohol, no tobacco. Water, taken as treatment, applied inside and outside the body, prescribed as a cure for the era's chronic complaints. Grain, plain and unrefined, prescribed as the foundation on which a healthy body was to be rebuilt. It was a gospel of health, laid down as revelation rather than as research, and a gospel needs a building to be practiced in. The building came in 1866. The church opened the Western Health Reform Institute on 8 acres at the edge of town, a small water cure hospital built to carry out the Whites' prescriptions in brick and running water rather than sermon. 8 acres, a handful of buildings, a handful of patients moving through baths and diets that had, at the time, no reputation beyond the church that ran them. Nothing about it in 1866 looked like the future of the American breakfast table. But the Institute would not stay small, and it would not stay in the hands of the people who founded it. 10 years passed before it found the man who would remake it. In 1876, the church installed a 24-year-old doctor, John Harvey Kellogg, as superintendent, young for the responsibility, young enough that the appointment itself was a kind of wager on the part of the church elders who made it. It paid off quickly. Kellogg took an institution built on religious conviction and began rebuilding it as a medical one, methodically, patient by patient, department by department. And then, in 1878, he gave it a new name. Not a name borrowed from any hospital in Europe or America. A name of his own coining, a word that did not exist in the English language before he put it on the door, the Battle Creek Sanitarium. Under Kellogg, the San stopped being a boarding house with a handful of patients answering to a church committee. It became something else entirely, a medical institution with a growing reputation, a lengthening waiting list, and a superintendent who intended for it to be the most famous medical resort in the country. That reputation did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way reputations arrived in the late 19th century, through newspapers, through pamphlets, through the patients who left Battle Creek cured, or claiming to be cured, and told others where to go. The institute that had opened on 8 acres with a handful of patients was, within a few years of Kellogg's arrival, no longer a local curiosity answering only to its founders, no longer a modest water cure in a farm town, no longer anything the church elders of 1866 would have recognized. It was becoming something the whole country would eventually hear about. Chapter 3: The Man Who Kept the Books. Under Kellogg, the regimen at the San took a shape unlike anything else practiced anywhere in the country. Patients descended into hydrotherapy baths that alternated scalding water with ice water, a treatment Kellogg insisted disciplined the nervous system the way exercise disciplined a muscle. They sat, fully clothed, inside wooden cabinets wired with electric light bulbs, sweating for an hour at a stretch to draw out impurities Kellogg was certain no ordinary bath could reach. They mounted mechanical horses, vibrating wooden frames, built to jolt the body through the motions of riding without the expense, the danger, or the horse. They ate no meat, drank no coffee, touched no alcohol, and worked their way instead through a menu Kellogg had engineered from grains, nuts, and an ever-expanding catalog of substitutes for whatever ordinary American cooking had gotten wrong. And underneath all of it sat a fixation Kellogg discussed in lecture halls, in dinner conversation, in print, with a candor that startled patients who had come to Battle Creek for almost any other reason. The bowel, its regularity, its contents, its standing in his private theory of nearly every disease known to medicine. He prescribed enemas by the gallon. He wrote at length on the subject. He was not being provocative. He meant it. None of it discouraged the people who came. If anything, the strangeness of the cure became part of its appeal, a mark of seriousness in an age of quack tonics and mail-order remedies. The guest registers filled, and they filled with the biggest names in the country. Henry Ford came, Thomas Edison came, J.C. Penney came, and so did Amelia Earhart. And so, on more than one occasion, did a sitting president of the United States. These were people with physicians of their own, with money enough to summon any treatment American medicine had to offer. They came to Battle Creek anyway, to sit in a light cabinet and ride a wooden horse and answer a stranger's earnest questions about their digestion, because by the turn of the century, the sanitarium's name carried a kind of authority no advertisement could buy. But the famous doctor was not the only Kellogg working inside the San. In the shadow of John Harvey Kellogg worked his younger brother, a quieter man named Will Keith Kellogg. Where the doctor lectured, diagnosed, and toured the country as the sanitarium's public face, Will Keith kept the books. He managed the staff. He ran the food experiments in the San's kitchens, the slow trial and error work of turning Ellen White's grain gospel into something a paying patient could actually sit down and eat. He did this for a quarter of a century. Not a season of it, not a decade. 25 years of unglamorous, uncredited labor, entering figures into ledgers while his brother's name filled the newspapers of 3 continents. The doctor did not treat him as a partner. He treated him as a clerk, corrected him in front of patients and employees alike, and gave no sign that the arrangement between 2 men who shared a surname was ever meant to change. Nothing about the bookkeeper's desk where he sat, night after night, balancing the San's accounts, suggested that he was the one who would eventually matter most to this story. He was not the story yet. He was only the man doing the arithmetic behind it. The famous Kellogg stood in the light he had built out of baths and cabinets and a reputation that reached the White House. The other Kellogg kept the books, in the shadow, and waited. Chapter 4. The Flake He Did Not Value. In 1894, a batch of boiled wheat sat forgotten overnight in the San's kitchens. Left past the hour, it should have gone back onto the stove. By morning, it had gone soft and faintly sour. The kind of failure that in most kitchens ended in the trash. Will Keith Kellogg, still running the food experiments as he had for years, sent it through the rollers anyway, expecting dough. The wheat did not roll into dough. It broke apart into thin, brittle sheets, and when those sheets went into the oven, they came out crisp, pale, and toasted, a texture nobody at the San had produced from a grain before. Dr. Kellogg turned the flakes over in his hands the way he turned over every new food that came out of his kitchens, weighing it purely as medicine. Here was something a weak stomach could digest. Here was something plain enough to fit Ellen White's gospel of grain and water. Here was something the San could serve at its own tables, and nothing more. He held in that moment the beginning of an industry that would eventually employ tens of thousands of people in his own town, and he saw a dietary supplement for dyspeptics. Keep that in mind. The flake sitting in the doctor's hands would still be sitting there, more or less 12 years later, when his brother finally walked out the door with it. In 1895, the brothers began selling the flakes under the name Granos, through a company organized for the purpose, the Sanitas Food Company. A patent for flaked cereal followed in April of 1896, filed quietly, granted quietly. The kind of paperwork that draws no notice outside the town where it is filed. Granos moved by mail order, sold almost entirely to former patients who wrote back to Battle Creek, asking for the food they remembered from their stay at the San. It was a health product, sold to a captive audience of the already converted. It was not yet by any measure a business. Step back 3 years, to February of 1891, before the flake existed at all. Charles William Post was a Texas-born businessman who had built and lost more than one venture before his health gave out entirely, arriving at the sanitarium broken, chronically ill, and out of remedies. He checked in as a patient and stayed 9 months, submitting to the baths, the diets, the electric cabinets, the whole catalog of Kellogg's regimen. None of it cured him. He left the San in roughly the same poor health he had arrived with, but converted all the same to the gospel that had failed to fix him. Post opened his own small health resort nearby, called La Vida Inn, and in a barn behind it began cooking a grain coffee substitute of his own recipe. Postum went to market in 1895. Grape nuts followed in 1897. Post wrote his own advertising copy, pamphlets with titles like The Road to Wellville, promising cures the San's own physicians would never have signed their names to. Post had no medical degree. Post had no patent on Kellogg's science. Post had only 9 months of memory and an instinct for selling it, and by 1903 that instinct was earning him $1 million a year, proof that the San's health gospel could be turned into cash by someone other than the man who preached it. The doctor had held the invention in his own hands and filed it under medicine. The patient had left the San with nothing but a diagnosis and turned it into a fortune. Chapter 5. The Year. The market caught fire. By the last months of 1902, Battle Creek could count more than 80 cereal companies in some stage of existence. Not 80 factories running full shifts, but 80 ventures at one point or another on paper, in a rented storefront, or standing behind a single rented roller and a name. The town that had produced Granos in 1895 and grape nuts in 1897 was now producing something else entirely: a rush. Anyone with a roller, a rented room, and a name could call himself a cereal manufacturer, and in Battle Creek in those years, a great many people did. The grains themselves hardly mattered. What mattered was getting a box on a shelf before the market noticed there was no shortage of boxes left to fill. Some companies sold flakes. Some companies sold health claims with no flakes behind them, borrowed doctors' names, and invented testimonials printed under a manufactured trademark. Some companies sold nothing at all but a stock certificate and a promise, collecting subscriptions from investors in Chicago and Detroit for a factory that was never built and a cereal that was never milled. The products that did reach a shelf carried names built for a crowded market: Malta Vita, Luck Boy, Corn O'Plenty, Honeymoon Brand, flavored with apples, with celery, with whatever the previous month's competitor had not yet tried, each one promising a cure the label's authors had never tested. The honest ventures and the fraudulent ones sat on the same shelves, indistinguishable to the customer buying either. The market corrected itself the way markets in Battle Creek tended to correct themselves in those years, quietly and on paper. 18 of the companies chartered during the rush were formally dissolved in 1905 and 1906 alone. Their rollers sold for scrap, their stock certificates worth exactly what the paper had cost to print. No trial accompanied most of the collapses. No one went to prison for selling shares in a cereal company that never produced a single box. The money had simply moved from one set of pockets to another, and Battle Creek went on producing cereal regardless, because underneath the counterfeits, 2 brothers and 1 converted patient were still building something that would outlast all 80 of the pretenders combined. The old order did not survive 1902 either. On February 18th of that year, the sanitarium's main building, the structure that had housed hydrotherapy baths, electric light cabinets, and 3 decades of Kellogg's growing reputation, burned to the ground. 10 months later, on December 30th, The Adventist publishing house followed it, a second fire closing out the same calendar year that had opened the cereal rush. Dr. Kellogg rebuilt the SAN within 12 months, larger than before and more expensively finished, an act of will that read, to anyone watching from outside, as confidence rather than grief. But the church did not rebuild in kind. In 1903, Seventh-day Adventist leadership moved its headquarters out of Battle Creek entirely, taking with it the institutional weight that had brought Ellen White's grain gospel to this particular town in the first place. The SAN stood taller than it had before the fire. The publishing house did not return, and the town that had been built, block by block, around a church's revelation about grain and water now belonged, block by block, to the industry that revelation had accidentally produced. Battle Creek had been a church town. It was, by every measure that mattered after 1903, a cereal town. Chapter 6. The Signature. On February 19, 1906, Will Keith Kellogg founded the Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company. He was 46 years old, and behind him sat a quarter-century of ledgers, patient rosters, and kitchen experiments entered in his own hand. 25 years of answering to a brother who had once turned a broken batch of wheat over in his palm and pronounced it a dietary supplement. Nothing more. That flake had sat unvalued in Dr. Kellogg's hands for 12 years. Will Keith walked out the door with it and put his own name on the box. He made his first change to the recipe almost immediately. Sugar, added to a flake his brother had spent a decade defending as unadulterated grain and water. It was a heresy against the SAN's gospel of grain and water, and Dr. Kellogg never forgave his brother for committing it. Then Will Keith did something no cereal maker in Battle Creek had done. He printed his own signature in looping cursive ink across the front of every package, with 4 words set beneath it. None genuine without this signature. It was not vanity. It was law, a trademark built directly out of a family name in a market where 80 rival companies could copy a recipe but could not copy a man's handwriting. The Kellogg name, argued over in private for a generation, was now a legal instrument printed on cardboard. A single advertisement in the Ladies' Home Journal did the rest. 1 page, 1 national magazine, and sales began climbing from 33 cases a day toward the beginnings of a national brand. 33 cases was the size of the operation Will Keith Kellogg had waited a quarter-century to run on his own terms. 1 advertisement was enough to start turning it into something else entirely. He kept turning it into something else for the rest of his career, and he did it as one of the great advertisers of the 20th century. Premiums that turned a cereal box into a toy, like the funny Jungle Land picture book tucked inside for children. Giveaways that turned a customer into a habit. Billboards that turned a family name into a landmark. Kellogg understood, earlier than almost anyone selling breakfast in America, that the box itself was the advertisement. In 1907, fire destroyed his main factory building. Will Keith Kellogg stood and watched it burn, and by the time the ashes had cooled, he had already ordered a larger plant built in its place. Fireproof this time, designed before the embers stopped smoking. What he could not build his way out of was his brother. For the better part of a decade, the 2 men sued each other over the right to the name printed on the box, through depositions, through appeals, through a trial in Michigan's courts that ran a full month. In December of 1920, the Michigan Supreme Court ruled for Will Keith. The signature was his. The trademark was his. The name belonged, by law, to the brother who had put it on cardboard, rather than the one who had first held the flake in his hands. The 2 men who had, between them, invented the modern American breakfast did not speak of it again in any way history has recorded. Dr. Kellogg went on running his sanitarium. Will Keith went on running his factory, a short distance away in the same small city. They exchanged little correspondence and less conversation for the rest of both their lives. They shared a last name, a hometown, and a hillside cemetery waiting at the end of it. They shared almost nothing else. Chapter 7. The Cure That Never Came. By the second decade of the 20th century, Charles William Post had built an empire on the opposite side of Battle Creek from the sanitarium that had failed to cure him. The Postum Works ran full shifts on the west side of town. The Post Edition, block after block of company-built housing, held the men and women who rolled his flakes and bottled his coffee substitute. The Post Tavern, a hotel built in his name, stood downtown, giving the buyers and salesmen who came to town somewhere grand to sleep. The empire ran on the same water and rail lines that had first drawn settlers to the confluence a century earlier. Though nobody driving past the Postum Works in 1913 was thinking about Sans McCamley's Canal, not a barn behind a rented health resort anymore, not 9 unrecovered months of somebody else's regimen, an actual empire built on the far side of the same small city that had once treated him as a patient and sent him home uncured. On May 9, 1914, Post died by his own hand. He was 59 years old. The chronic illness that had sent him to the sanitarium in 1891 had never released him. Not in 23 years, not through a fortune built on food sold as the cure for exactly what he had. His daughter, Marjorie Meriwether Post, was 27 that year, and she inherited a fortune of roughly $20 million. In 1929, the Postum Company became General Foods, and the decisions that had once been made in a barn behind a health resort on the edge of Battle Creek moved permanently to New York. The second dynasty this town had produced was now an absentee one. Remember that. The story comes back to it. The sanitarium answered the boom the way it had always answered everything. It built bigger. In 1928, the San raised the towers, a 14-story addition of 265 guest rooms, the tallest structure Battle Creek had ever put up. Credit was cheap that year, and hotel additions like it were rising in cities across the country, each one betting that the boom would keep paying for itself. The towers went up at the exact top of the market, financed by the same confidence that within 18 months would collapse across the entire country. Picture Battle Creek on a weekday morning in 1928. The air over the whole downtown smells of toasted corn before a visitor ever sees a factory, carried on the wind from both ends of town at once. At the Kellogg plant, the ovens are running full shifts. At the Post Works across town, the ovens are running full shifts too. Freight trains idle at the rail yards loading boxcars of cereal bound for grocers in every state in the Union, cars that needed no separate advertisement because the brand name was already stenciled on the side. Downtown in the marble lobby of the Post Tavern, traveling salesmen wait for appointments with buyers who will decide what a breakfast table looks like in 1,000 towns none of them has ever visited. Above all of it, the white towers of the sanitarium rise 14 stories over a city of 43,000, the tallest thing Battle Creek has ever built. Finished the same year the market paying for it began to wobble. 2 brothers no longer speaking, one dead man's daughter with $20 million, and a company already answering to New York, 100,000 grocery shelves across the country stocked from the same few blocks of Michigan. All of it on that one ordinary morning still running at full production. It was a city of 43,000 people feeding breakfast to a nation, and nothing in the smell of the corn or the sound of the trains suggested how close the top of a market sits to its edge. Chapter 8. The Hillside Again. The sanitarium did not collapse. It simply emptied. The stock market fell in October of 1929, and within weeks, the effect in Battle Creek showed up not as panic in the streets, but as empty rooms in the towers, finished barely a year earlier at the exact top of a market that no longer existed. The rich patients who had filled the Sands baths and light cabinets for 3 decades did not send word explaining themselves. No letters, no cancellations, no patience. Dr. Kellogg's regimen required leisure, money, and a confidence about the future that had vanished from the country almost overnight, and hydrotherapy alone was never going to replace any of the three. By 1933, the arithmetic caught up with the building. The sanitarium went into receivership, carrying roughly $3 million of construction debt run up across decades of rebuilding after fires and expanding after booms. Dr. Kellogg was 70 that year, and the empire he had built out of a word he invented himself, a name that had once summoned presidents and industrialists to a small Michigan farm town, did not recover. It limped on in reduced form, but it never filled the towers again the way it had filled them in 1928. Will Keith Kellogg went the other direction. Where his brother's institution had been built for spending, WK's factory had been built for running, and running it through the Depression meant deciding who kept a wage coming into the house. He split the plant's shifts into a 6-hour workday instead of 8, spreading the same payroll across more workers, so that more Battle Creek families had something rather than a few families having everything. It was not charity, it was arithmetic, applied to a factory floor instead of a balance sheet. In June of 1930, he founded the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. 4 years later, in 1934, he endowed it with more than $66 million in company stock, one of the largest single gifts in American history to that date. The man who had once entered figures into another man's ledgers for a quarter century was, by his 60s, giving away a fortune larger than most of the companies that had outproduced him during the cereal rush. The sanitarium's buildings found their next use in wartime. In 1942, the Army bought the Sands main buildings for $2,341,000 and opened Percy Jones General Hospital there, treating the wounded of the Second World War in the same corridors where hydrotherapy patients had once alternated scalding water with ice. 3 of the men who passed through as patients, Bob Dole, Philip Hart, and Daniel Inouye, later served together in the United States Senate, and the building was eventually renamed in their honor, the Hart-Dole-Inouye Federal Center. The towers, raised in 1928 at the exact top of a market that fell apart a year later, were still standing when the Army came looking for a hospital. They are standing under that renamed federal building today. On October 6, 1951, W.K. Kellogg died at 91. Blind for the last decade of his life. He was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery on the same hillside that already held Sojourner Truth, dead since 1883, and his estranged brother, 2 men who had stopped speaking over a spoonful of sugar now lying a short walk apart. The following year, the company he had founded put a cartoon tiger named Tony on a box of sugar-frosted flakes, and in 1952, television carried him into homes across the country, turning Battle Creek's factories into the engine of a brand that was no longer regional, no longer merely national. It was global now. The brand was everywhere. The 2 men who had built it were on the hillside. Chapter 9: The Merger and the Museum. In 1960, Battle Creek's population peaked at 44,169. It was the largest the city would ever be. And the slide began in the same decade the number was recorded, the middle class moving out to Bedford Township, to Emmett Township, to Penfield Township, the ring of communities absorbing families that had once filled the neighborhood's walking distance from the plants. Downtown withered in a particular way. Not burned out, not boarded up overnight, just gradually emptied of the shops and offices that had depended on a resident population rather than a working one. The Kellogg and Post plants kept running full shifts through the same years, the storefronts around them closed one by one. It had become a company town whose company no longer needed the town's main street. The flakes still moved out by rail and by truck. The payroll still cleared every 2 weeks. None of it required anyone to walk downtown to spend it. Post, by these years, was no longer even a Battle Creek institution in the way its founder had built it. It was a division, Run out of General Foods headquarters in New York, its Battle Creek plant reporting upward through a corporate structure that had nothing to do with a barn behind a rented health resort. 3 chapters back, that fact was set aside with a promise that the story would come back to it. Here it is. The second dynasty this town produced was now fully absentee, its ovens still running on the west side of town, its decisions made hundreds of miles away by men who had never lived here. In 1982, Kellogg chairman William Lamothe told the city plainly what its choices were: merge with Battle Creek Township, or Kellogg would move its headquarters elsewhere. Opponents called it corporate blackmail. The votes were counted anyway. In the city, 6,857 in favor to 3,804 against. In the township, 9,524 in favor to 816 against. In the merged tally, 2 populations that had been sliding apart for 2 decades were counted back together as one city, which nearly doubled in size on paper without a single new resident moving in. In 1986, Kellogg opened a new headquarters downtown, a visible building with the company's name on the door, replacing decades of scattered offices with one structure planted deliberately near the river it had grown up beside. For a moment, the marriage of company and city looked saved. A chairman's ultimatum, a contested vote, and 4 years later a building that said the company still intended to be here. The change that mattered arrived without a vote count of its own. It was in the cereal bowl itself. Americans, over the following years, simply began eating breakfast differently. A granola bar eaten at a desk, a yogurt cup taken from a refrigerator, a bag of something picked up at a drive-through window on the way to work. None of it required a bowl, a spoon, or 5 minutes at a kitchen table, and cereal required all 3. Between 1997 and 1999, Kellogg cut more than 1,700 jobs in Battle Creek in 2 years, the kind of number a company town feels in every neighborhood, not only downtown. In 1998, the company had opened Kellogg's Cereal City, USA, a theme attraction built to celebrate the industry Battle Creek had invented. A working demonstration line, exhibits on the Founding Brothers, a gift shop selling the same flakes the city had shipped out by boxcar for a century. It closed in 2007 for lack of visitors. A museum built to honor an industry closed for lack of interest, while the industry it honored was still running down the street, still paying what remained of a payroll, still shipping flakes out on trucks instead of rail cars. Chapter 10. The Name Without the Company. The theme park's closing in 2007 was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was structural, and by 2023 it had a date on it. On October 2nd of that year, the Kellogg Company, the name WK had stamped on every package, none genuine without this signature, split itself in 2. Kellanova took the snacks, roughly 82% of the parent company's sales, and a new headquarters in Chicago. W.K. Kellogg Company kept the founder's own name and kept Battle Creek, along with the North American cereal business that had once been the entire reason the company existed. The split did not last as an independent arrangement. In 2024, Mars agreed to buy Kellanova for roughly $36 billion. In 2025, the Italian confectioner Ferrero bought W.K. Kellogg Company for $3.1 billion. Both heirs sold within 2 years of being born. After 119 years, no independent company named Kellogg exists anywhere in the world. The decisions about what happens inside Battle Creek's plants are now made in McLean, Virginia, where Mars keeps its offices, and in Alba, Italy, where Ferrero keeps its own. 2 addresses on 2 continents, neither of them Battle Creek, both carrying more authority over the city's factories than the city itself. What remains on the ground? Roughly 850 W.K. Kellogg employees, about 600 Kellanova employees. 60 years earlier, that payroll had defined who owned a house on the west side, whose name was on the Little League roster, whose children filled the pews on Sunday. The empire did not end in flames. It ended in filings. What survives sorts itself into a short inventory, and the items in it are not the ones the town would have bet on in 1928. Not the flashiest cereal maker of the 80 that once competed here. Not the tallest building on the skyline. Not the loudest advertiser. The Post plant, founded by a man who did not live to see 1915, is still baking cereal in Battle Creek, more than 125 years of continuous production, roughly 800 workers still on the line, the company he built having been sold and folded into General Foods decades before the plant itself stopped running. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation, endowed in the middle of the Depression out of a fortune its founder made spooning sugar onto corn, now holds $8.7 billion in assets and ranks among the largest philanthropies on Earth, still headquartered a few blocks from the room where the first flakes were rolled out. Fort Custer Industrial Park, a stretch of land with nothing to do with breakfast at all, now holds more than 80 companies and about 13,000 jobs, most of them in auto parts, the city quietly teaching itself to live on transmissions and brake assemblies instead of cornflakes. Every June, the city still closes off the middle of downtown and sets a single table running its length for the world's longest breakfast table. A tradition entered into the record books in 1979 and kept up every year since, regardless of who happens to own the plants that summer. The population stands near 52,700, down from its 1960 peak. The poverty rate runs above 17%. The median household income sits around $55,000. The old sanitarium still stands on its rise above the river, government offices working now behind its marble columns, and the towers, raised in 1928 at the exact top of a market that fell apart a year later, are still the tallest thing on the skyline, regardless of who was ever solvent enough to fill their rooms. On a clear morning, the air over downtown Battle Creek still smells faintly of toasted grain. It drifts from plants whose owners have never set foot in the city that makes their product, over rooftops and rail sidings that once belonged to men who lived within walking distance of the ovens they ran. The smell settles, as it always has, over a low rise at Oak Hill Cemetery, where two brothers who between them invented the American breakfast lie a short walk apart from each other, close enough to visit, far enough to have never once reconciled. Sojourner Truth is buried on the same hillside. The grain smell reaches her too. It is the only thing up there that still reaches everyone equally.